What happens when the most rigorous scientific mind of an era encounters the infinite? When I was 12, I discovered the 32nd proposition of Euclid by pure reasoning, knowing nothing of geometry except that a line was the shortest distance between 2 points. By 16, I had written a treatise on conic sections that amazed Descartes himself. By 19, I had invented the first mechanical calculator. Yet all these achievements in mathematics and physics led me not away from God, but inexorably toward Him. Today, I want to share with you the most extraordinary journey of my life, how the same scientific method that revealed atmospheric pressure and probability theory ultimately revealed the necessity of divine grace. This is not the story of reason versus faith, but of reason finding its true home in faith, and faith discovering its most powerful ally in rigorous thinking. Prepare to discover why the greatest intellectual honesty demands not skepticism, but surrender to the infinite. Chapter 1: The Mathematical Prodigy's Early Doubts. My childhood was marked by an insatiable hunger for truth through demonstration. While other children played, I dissected problems with geometrical precision. When my father Etienne forbade me to study mathematics before learning Latin and Greek, I secretly rediscovered Euclidean geometry in our drawing room, using terms I invented myself. I called circles, rounds, and lines, bars, but the logic was flawless. This early experience taught me that truth exists independently of our knowledge of it, waiting to be discovered by persistent inquiry. But this same logical precision that brought triumph in mathematics created profound unease when applied to questions of ultimate meaning. If mathematical truths were eternal and unchanging, why did human existence seem so fragile and temporary? If geometric proofs could achieve absolute certainty, why did life's most important questions remain shrouded in uncertainty? By my 20s, I had solved problems that had puzzled mathematicians for centuries, yet I felt increasingly dissatisfied with purely intellectual achievements. The disconnect between mathematical elegance and existential chaos troubled me deeply. I could calculate the probability of various outcomes in games of chance with perfect accuracy, yet I could not calculate the probability that life itself had meaning. I could demonstrate that the angles of a triangle always sum to exactly 180 degrees, yet I could not demonstrate why triangle or angle or degree should matter to anyone. Every mathematical victory felt simultaneously like a triumph of reason and a reminder of reason's limitations. This tension reached its peak during my work on atmospheric pressure. Through careful experiments, I demonstrated that what Aristotle called nature's horror of a vacuum was actually the measurable weight of the atmosphere. Yet even as I celebrated this victory of empirical method over ancient authority, I realized I was simply pushing the mystery back one level. Why should there be an atmosphere at all? Why should there be laws that govern atmospheric behavior? Why should human minds be capable of discovering these laws? The more successful my scientific investigations became, the more urgent these questions seemed. My early skepticism was not the cheap cynicism that dismisses all claims to truth, but the rigorous doubt of someone who had tasted real certainty in mathematics and desperately wanted that same certainty in matters of ultimate significance. I had proven that the human mind could achieve absolute knowledge about triangles and curves, but could it achieve similar knowledge about the meaning of existence itself? This question would drive everything that followed. Chapter 2: The Weight of Atmospheric Pressure and Spiritual Vacuum. The experiments that made my scientific reputation also created my deepest spiritual crisis. When I proved that mercury rises in a barometer not because nature abhors a vacuum, but because atmospheric weight pushes it up, I felt the intoxicating power of experimental method. Here was truth you could measure, verify, reproduce. Yet this very success highlighted a disturbing parallel. If physical nature tolerated vacuum, perhaps spiritual nature did as well. I began to notice that the same precision that revealed atmospheric pressure also revealed a kind of existential pressure. Human beings seemed constantly pushed by forces they neither understood nor controlled, much like mercury in my barometer. We rise and fall according to invisible weights pressing upon us from all directions. But unlike mercury, we possess consciousness of our situation, which transforms mechanical pressure into spiritual anguish. The mathematical elegance of my atmospheric calculations stood in stark contrast to the chaotic unpredictability of human motivation. I could predict exactly how high mercury would rise at different altitudes, but I could not predict whether tomorrow would bring meaning or despair. I could measure variations in air pressure with exacting precision, but the pressure of existence itself seemed to resist all measurement. This asymmetry troubled me profoundly. During this period, I became fascinated with the concept of the infinite. Mathematical infinity was a beautiful abstraction that helped solve problems in geometry and calculus. But existential infinity was a terrifying reality that made all finite achievements seem worthless. If space extended infinitely in all directions, what significance could our small planet possess? If time stretched infinitely into past and future, what importance could our brief lives claim? The same intellectual tools that revealed mathematical truth seemed to dissolve human significance. Yet even in the depths of this spiritual vacuum, I noticed something remarkable. The very capacity to recognize meaninglessness seemed to point beyond meaninglessness. A purely material creature would not experience existential anxiety because it would lack the mental framework necessary for such experience. The fact that humans could conceive of infinite space and time, even though such conceptions tormented us, suggested something extraordinary about human nature itself. My experiments with atmospheric pressure had taught me that apparent emptiness often conceals invisible but measurable forces. Perhaps the same principle applied to spiritual reality. Perhaps what seemed like meaningless void actually contained spiritual pressure that human instruments were not yet sophisticated enough to detect. This possibility intrigued me, but I needed more than speculation. I needed experimental evidence. The transition from physical to spiritual investigation required the same methodological rigor I had applied to atmospheric studies. I would test spiritual hypotheses with the same care I had used to test physical ones. This decision would transform everything. Chapter 3: Probability Theory and the Mathematics of Decision. My collaboration with Fermat on probability theory began as an intellectual exercise about gambling, but it quickly became the foundation for analyzing life's most crucial decisions. When the Chevalier de Mere asked us to resolve questions about dice games and card distributions, we developed mathematical tools that would revolutionize not just mathematics, but rational decision-making itself. Little did I realize that these techniques would ultimately lead me to faith, not away from it. The key insight emerged from studying decisions under uncertainty. In gambling, you never know which specific cards will be dealt or how dice will fall, but you can calculate the probability of various outcomes and make rational choices based on expected value. If a bet offers a 50% chance of winning $2 with only a $1 stake, the expected value is positive and the bet is mathematically sound, regardless of any single outcome. This mathematical framework suddenly illuminated the spiritual questions that had tormented me for years. Most philosophical and theological arguments focused on achieving absolute certainty about God's existence, but probability theory suggested a different approach. Instead of asking whether we could prove God exists with mathematical certainty, we should ask whether belief in God represents a rational bet given the available evidence and potential outcomes. When I applied this analysis to religious belief, the results were stunning. Consider the possible outcomes: either God exists or God does not exist. If God exists and I believe, the potential gain is infinite, eternal happiness. If God exists and I disbelieve, the potential loss is infinite, eternal separation from the source of all good. If God does not exist, the difference between belief and disbelief is finite, some temporal pleasures foregone or gained. Any rational person should choose the option with infinite positive expected value over any option with finite expected value. But this was only the beginning of my analysis. The wager argument revealed something profound about the relationship between reason and faith. Reason could not provide absolute certainty about God's existence, but it could demonstrate that faith was the most rational response to uncertainty. Far from being opposed to logic, faith emerged as the most logical attitude toward ultimate questions. The mathematical precision of probability theory also illuminated the nature of spiritual evidence. Just as atmospheric pressure could be measured only with proper instruments, spiritual reality might require proper spiritual sensitivity to detect. A person whose heart was closed to divine influence would be like a barometer with a broken seal, incapable of registering pressure that was nevertheless real and measurable by properly functioning instruments. This realization transformed my understanding of doubt itself. Intellectual uncertainty about God's existence was not a barrier to faith but a precondition for it. If God's existence were mathematically demonstrable, faith would be unnecessary. The fact that ultimate questions required decision under uncertainty was not a flaw in the design of reality but its most beautiful feature. Faith was not the enemy of reason but reason's natural completion. Armed with these insights, I began to approach spiritual questions with the same experimental rigor I had applied to mathematical and physical problems. I would test the hypothesis of God's existence not through abstract argument but through practical experiment in living. Chapter 4: The Night of Fire, When Logic Encountered Love. On November 23, 1654, something happened that transformed my entire understanding of the relationship between reason and reality. I had spent months developing my probabilistic analysis of religious belief, convinced that rational argument was the path to truth. But on that night, alone in my study, I encountered something that transcended all my calculations while simultaneously fulfilling them. I experienced what I can only call the living God, not the God of philosophers and scholars, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The experience lasted approximately 2 hours, from 10:30 until 10:30 midnight. During those moments, every intellectual barrier that had separated me from faith simply dissolved. This was not anti-rational mysticism overriding careful thinking, but the revelation that reality itself was more magnificent than even the most rigorous thinking could grasp. I felt simultaneously the absolute certainty I had sought in mathematics and the infinite love I had never dared to hope for in existence. What struck me most powerfully was how this experience illuminated rather than contradicted my previous mathematical and scientific work. The same God who had established the mathematical laws I had discovered in geometry and probability was revealing himself personally. The universe was not divided between mathematical necessity and personal love, but was structured by a divine intelligence that was simultaneously perfectly logical and infinitely compassionate. I wrote a brief account of this encounter on a piece of parchment that I kept sewn into my jacket for the rest of my life. The words were simple but precise: fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and savants. Certainty. Certainty. Heartfelt joy, peace. These were not the ravings of an overwrought imagination, but the careful notes of a scientist recording an unexpected but unmistakable experimental result. This experience resolved the tension between reason and faith that had plagued me for years, but not by abandoning reason. Instead, I discovered that reason had always been pointing toward this encounter. My mathematical investigations had revealed the beautiful order underlying apparent chaos. My atmospheric experiments had demonstrated invisible forces acting according to precise laws. My probability calculations had shown that faith was the most rational response to uncertainty. All of these discoveries had been preparing me to recognize divine action when I finally encountered it directly. The transformation was not merely emotional but intellectual. I suddenly understood that the God revealed in Scripture was not a different God from the one implied by natural philosophy, but the same God approached through different but complementary paths. The mathematical elegance that governed planetary motion and geometric proofs reflected the same divine mind that had spoken through prophets and became incarnate in Christ. This recognition revolutionized my approach to apologetic. Instead of seeing faith and reason as competitors for intellectual allegiance, I began to see them as partners in a comprehensive investigation of reality. Reason prepared the heart to recognize divine truth, while faith provided the context within which reason could achieve its full potential. From that night forward, my scientific and mathematical work took on new significance. Each discovery became not just an advancement of human knowledge, but a glimpse into the mind of God. Each proof became not just a demonstration of logical necessity, but a participation in divine thinking. The universe revealed itself as a vast mathematical poem written by infinite love. Chapter 5: The Heart's Reasons That Reason Cannot Know. Following my encounter with divine reality, I faced the challenge of communicating this truth to minds trained in the same rigorous skepticism that had once characterized my own thinking. How could I explain to fellow mathematicians and natural philosophers that the most important truths required not just logical demonstration but what I came to call the reasons of the heart? This phrase has been misunderstood for centuries as anti-rational romanticism, but it actually represents my most sophisticated insight into the nature of knowledge itself. The heart, in my understanding, is not the seat of irrational emotion opposed to cool logic, but rather the faculty by which we recognize first principles that make rational thought possible. When I say the heart has its reasons that reason cannot know, I mean that rational demonstration always depends on starting points that cannot themselves be rationally demonstrated without circular reasoning. Even in mathematics, we begin with axioms that seem self-evident to properly functioning minds but cannot be proven from more basic premises. Consider my work in geometry. When I demonstrated new theorems about conic sections, I relied on axioms about points, lines, and planes that seemed obviously true but could not be derived from anything more fundamental. The capacity to recognize these starting points as valid was not itself a rational process but something more basic, what I called the heart's knowledge. Without this foundational recognition, rational demonstration would be impossible. The same principle applies to our knowledge of moral and spiritual realities. When we recognize that cruelty is wrong or that love is good, we are not deriving these conclusions from more basic moral premises through logical steps. Instead, we are exercising the heart's capacity to recognize moral truth directly. This recognition is not less reliable than rational demonstration. It is the foundation that makes rational demonstration possible in the first place. My scientific experiments had taught me that different kinds of instruments were needed to detect different kinds of reality. Atmospheric pressure required a barometer, while geometric relationships required compass and straightedge. Similarly, spiritual realities required spiritual sensitivity, what I called the heart, to detect and understand them. A person attempting to perceive God through purely logical analysis was like someone trying to measure atmospheric pressure with a ruler. They were using the wrong instrument for the task. This insight revolutionized my approach to Christian apologetic. Instead of trying to force divine truth into purely rational categories, I began developing what we might call experimental apologetic. I invited skeptics to test spiritual hypotheses through practical experience, just as I had tested physical hypotheses through controlled experiments. Pray regularly for a month and observe the results. Practice genuine love toward enemies and note the effects on your own heart. Study Scripture with the same careful attention you would give to a scientific text and record your observations. The results of such experiments could not be reduced to mathematical proofs, but they generated knowledge that was no less reliable than mathematical knowledge. Just as repeated experiments with atmospheric pressure had convinced me of its reality despite being invisible, Repeated experiments with spiritual reality convinced me of God's presence despite being non-material. This approach also resolved the apparent conflict between divine sovereignty and human freedom that had puzzled theologians for centuries. God's governance of the universe operated through the same kind of natural laws I had discovered in physics, but human hearts retained the capacity to respond or resist divine influence, just as barometers could be broken or properly functioning. Grace worked through spiritual laws as reliable as physical laws, but these laws respected rather than overrode human dignity. The heart's reasons thus became the foundation for a truly comprehensive approach to truth that honored both scientific rigor and spiritual reality. Chapter 6: The Provincial Letters, Reason in Service of Truth. When the Faculty of Theology at the Sorbonne condemned my friend Antoine Arnauld for defending Augustine's teaching on grace, I faced a choice that would define my understanding of how reason should serve truth. The Jesuits had crafted sophisticated philosophical arguments to justify what I considered moral compromises, while the Jansenists maintained rigid positions that seemed to deny human responsibility entirely. Both sides claimed rational support for their positions, yet both seemed to miss the deeper truth about how divine grace and human freedom actually operate. My response took the form of 18 anonymous letters that became known as the Provincial Letters. Through these letters, I pioneered a new kind of apologetic writing that combined rigorous logical analysis with accessible prose, mathematical precision with moral passion. I demonstrated that the same intellectual honesty that governed my scientific investigations could expose theological sophistry and defend authentic Christian teaching. The Jesuits had developed what they called probabilism, the doctrine that one could safely follow any opinion that had some probability of being correct, even if other opinions were more probably true. They applied this principle to moral theology, arguing that confessors could approve actions as long as some respectable theologian had deemed them permissible, regardless of what the majority of moral authorities taught. This seemed to me a perversion of the probabilistic reasoning I had developed with Fermat. In my mathematical work, probability theory helped identify the most rational choice among uncertain options, but it never suggested that any choice with some non-zero probability was equally valid. If one bet offered a 90% chance of success and another offered only 10%, rational decision-making required choosing the first option, not treating both as equivalent because both were possible. The Jesuit application of probabilism to moral theology violated this basic principle by treating less probable moral opinions as practically equivalent to more probable ones. Using the same analytical tools I had applied to atmospheric pressure and gambling problems, I demonstrated that Jesuit casuistry systematically favored convenient conclusions over truth. They would find the most lenient opinion available on any moral question and declare it safely followable, regardless of how flimsy its foundations or how it contradicted more solid teaching. This was not honest probabilistic analysis but sophisticated rationalization. Yet I was equally critical of Jansenist rigidity that seemed to make divine grace so overpowering that human cooperation became meaningless. My scientific work had taught me that natural laws operated through secondary causes rather than bypassing them. Water flowed downhill because of gravitational attraction, but it still flowed through natural channels rather than floating mysteriously through the air. Similarly, divine grace should work through human will rather than replacing it entirely. The Provincial Letters demonstrated how authentic reason serves truth by exposing both laxity and rigidity as forms of intellectual dishonesty. True rational analysis required following evidence wherever it led, even when conclusions were inconvenient or complex. Neither Jesuit sophistication nor Jansenist simplicity could substitute for careful attention to how grace and freedom actually operated in human experience. My approach combined logical precision with literary artistry, making complex theological arguments accessible to educated laypeople while maintaining scholarly rigor. I used mathematical analogies to clarify abstract concepts, drew on my scientific experience to illustrate how divine action might work through natural processes, and employed satirical humor to expose the absurdity of various theological positions. The response was extraordinary. These letters were read throughout Europe and translated into multiple languages. Even opponents admitted their literary excellence while disputing their theological conclusions. I had demonstrated that Christian apologetic could be simultaneously intellectually rigorous and broadly accessible, deeply faithful to tradition and thoroughly contemporary in method. Most importantly, the provincial letters established a model for how reason should serve truth rather than partisan advantage. This would guide all my subsequent work. Chapter 7: The Pensées, Mathematical Intuition Applied to Human Nature. In my final years, I undertook the most ambitious project of my life, a comprehensive defense of Christian truth that would apply the same rigorous methodology I had used in mathematics and physics to the deepest questions of human existence. What emerged was not a systematic treatise but a collection of profound insights that I called my pensées, thoughts that penetrated to the mathematical structure underlying the human condition itself. The central insight that guided this work was my recognition that human nature exhibits the same kind of logical consistency I had discovered in geometric relationships, but this consistency revealed a fundamental paradox that could only be resolved through divine intervention. Human beings simultaneously demonstrate capacities that point toward infinite dignity and limitations that reveal profound corruption. We are capable of mathematical reasoning that grasps eternal truths. Yet we are motivated by petty vanities that last only moments. We long for perfect justice, yet we consistently choose our own advantage over genuine fairness. This contradiction was not accidental but structural. Through careful analysis of human behavior, I discovered that people consistently act as though they were designed for infinite happiness yet equipped only for finite pleasures. We pursue wealth, honor, and pleasure with desperate intensity, but achieving these goals never provides the satisfaction we expected. Each success reveals the inadequacy of finite goods to fill what Augustine had called the God-shaped vacuum in the human heart. Using probabilistic analysis, I demonstrated that this pattern could not be explained by random evolutionary processes. If human beings had evolved purely through natural selection, we would expect their desires to match their environment. Creatures would seek only what was attainable and find satisfaction in what they could achieve. The universal human experience of longing for more than the material world can provide suggested that human nature had been shaped by realities beyond the material world. My mathematical training had taught me to look for elegant solutions to complex problems. The Christian doctrine of the fall provided exactly such an elegant solution to the paradox of human nature. If humans had been created for communion with infinite goodness but had lost this relationship through moral rebellion, we would expect them to retain enough of their original nature to long for the infinite while being too corrupted to achieve it through their own efforts. This hypothesis predicted precisely the behavioral patterns I observed in myself and others. But the same analytical approach that revealed the problem also pointed toward its solution. The mathematical concept of infinity had taught me that infinite quantities follow different rules from finite ones. Infinite mercy could forgive finite sins without being diminished. Infinite love could embrace finite creatures without being reduced. The Incarnation represented the intersection of infinite and finite realities, the only kind of intervention that could restore the original relationship between human nature and divine nature. I developed what I called the wager, not as a proof of God's existence but as a demonstration that faith represented the most rational response to our existential situation. Given the mathematical structure of human longing and the potential consequences of our ultimate choice, believing in God offered infinite positive expected value while disbelief offered at best finite benefits. Any rational person should choose the option with infinite potential gain. Yet I also recognized that rational analysis alone could not produce faith. The same heart that recognized mathematical first principles had to recognize spiritual truth. This was why I emphasized that the goal of apologetic was not to force belief through logical demonstration but to prepare the heart to receive divine grace. Reason could remove barriers to faith and show faith's rationality, but only God could grant faith itself. My pensées thus represented the culmination of everything I had learned about the relationship between reason and truth. Mathematical precision illuminated the structure of human experience. Scientific methodology revealed the inadequacy of purely natural explanations for human nature. Probabilistic analysis demonstrated the rationality of faith. But all of these rational approaches pointed beyond themselves toward realities that could be known only through divine gift. This integration of rigorous thinking with spiritual humility became my legacy to those who would seek truth through both reason and faith. Conclusion. The journey from mathematical skepticism to Christian faith was not a retreat from reason but reason's ultimate triumph. Every step of my intellectual development, from discovering Euclidean geometry as a child to measuring atmospheric pressure as a scientist to calculating probabilities as a mathematician, prepared me to recognize that the God revealed in Scripture was the same God whose mathematical laws govern the natural world. Faith and reason were not opponents but dance partners, each leading the other toward deeper truth. Today, when many assume that scientific progress makes religious belief obsolete, my experience suggests exactly the opposite conclusion. The more rigorously we investigate reality, the more clearly we see that it points beyond itself toward infinite intelligence and love. The mathematical elegance of natural laws, the fine-tuning of physical constants, the logical structure of human reasoning itself, all of these discoveries strengthen rather than weaken the case for divine design. True scientific humility recognizes that every answer raises deeper questions, every explanation reveals greater mysteries. The heart that learns to read the mathematical poetry of creation naturally learns to worship its author.